Let's get into the video. Guess whose Christmas is ruined now? Mom. I 30 moved from the central US to the northwest coast when I was 22, mostly to get away from my crazy mother. Most of my family were all enablers of her behavior because they found it easier to just go along with it than fight her over it. Save for my 3 older sisters, who got out of Dodge because they couldn't take her SHT. One of them even moved to Canada. So yeah, I was not only the only boy but also the youngest, which made me a perpetual baby in my mother's eyes. So my mother often tried to infantilize me growing up. She tried to spoon-feed me when I was 16, then complained that I wasn't being supportive of her when I refused to let her do things like that. Then she gaslit me when I didn't cave to her whining. Her behavior has been manipulative and narcissistic for as long as I can remember. She tended to say everything about herself. Some referred to her as having a queen mother complex. She always expected to be honored and revered on any holiday, because even my birthdays had to be all about her, even when she did none of the work or planning. She showed up to my 21st birthday in an outfit that looked a lot like a wedding dress of sorts. Then she expected me to escort her by the arm everywhere from the moment she arrived. We were just celebrating at a local bar, not some sort of fancy club, so that went about as well as you can expect. And she made a huge fuss, saying I was humiliating her on her day. When I remarked that it wasn't her day, it was mine, she threw a tantrum and ran out like a teenage girl who'd just been dumped at the prom. And that wasn't all. She had some other habits that were unbelievably creepy toward me. She attempted to sit in my lap a few times and said she wanted cuddles. I openly called that weird, and she repeated her usual pouting and gaslighting. When she was 45, she started openly talking to other people near me about wanting to get a facelift and breast implants to look 20 years younger. And she'd give me the side eye while doing it. But my father adamantly said he'd never pay for such unneeded things. That sparked many fights where she called him unsupportive, then spent weeks playing the victim. We were never big churchgoers, but she'd drag my father and me to the local Mormon church on random Sundays when she wanted to try and get back at me for not enabling her. We weren't even Mormons, but it was the closest church to us. She once put me on the spot, trying to infantilize me in front of an entire congregation of people after the sermon, and I called her out on what she was really doing. Then I just walked out. That was the last straw, and I moved out to rent a small room at a friend's parents' house for $200 a month. When I was packing to leave, she was begging me to stay almost the entire time. I told her I was her son, not her husband, and I was sick of the creepy way she was acting around me. I had my own life to live after all. She just ran away sobbing, and we didn't talk for months. I learned from my cousin that she was going around saying I'd come running back to her bosom any day. But when I didn't, she lost her SHT. My mother, even years after I became an adult, openly talked to me like a small child in front of other people and expected me to play along with it. And when I didn't, she'd first give me an expression like she was pleading with me. But I just stayed stone-faced. That made her grab me by the arm and try to drag me outside like a little kid to loudly whisper in my ear. But I always refused to let her go, and I even threw her off a few times when she refused to let go. And the last time she attempted that, she dug her nails into my shoulder. So I swatted her hand away so hard that there was a bruise left on it. That made her switch to mostly emotional manipulation. We both went to my uncle's birthday party, and while there, she was openly following me around and loudly talking to my aunt about the way I used to breastfeed as a child anytime she was close to me. And she even said she lamented that she couldn't still make me do that, then gave me that pleading look again. I wanted to throw up. My aunt was visibly disgusted, as I'd told her about a lot of the previous things, but I guess she never really believed it was as bad as I said until that day. When I refused to cater to my mother at the party, she eventually broke down and loudly stated that she was the matriarch and that what she says goes. Then she tried to order me to come to her like a little boy. I reminded her that I didn't live with her anymore, nor did I have to do as she said because I wasn't a child. And then several other family members backed me up for the first time ever, which actually shocked me. That made my mother screech at us all and then leave, only to call me multiple times later to try and gaslight me over the phone. I let it all go to voicemail. Before making the choice to leave my home city, I had a girlfriend there I really liked. We'd been dating for a few months, and she wanted to meet my family. I was skeptical and warned her about my mother, but she must have thought I was joking. Boy, was she surprised. My mother was especially passive and aggressive towards her when they met, because she was taking her baby away. As we both heard her say to a relative over the phone in the kitchen when she thought no one else was listening. And then later, while cutting a cake she baked, my mother gave my at-the-time girlfriend an eerie stare while holding a large kitchen knife. Needless to say, that poor girl couldn't deal with my mother for very long, and we ended things amicably soon after because she never wanted to risk having someone like my mother as a mother-in-law. Sadly, I had to completely agree. So when I told my mother I was moving over 1,000 miles away, she went ballistic. And she tried to latch onto me and say that she wouldn't allow it. But I threw her off and said she didn't have the power to stop me. I'd saved as much as I could for years, bought a truck and camper trailer, and spent another 2 years living out of said camper while working a simple job in Northern California. During this time, I didn't bother to keep in contact with any family at all. Eventually, I met someone new, and she and I are still together to this day. Though neither of us are really interested in marriage or children, when I finally broke the NC with my parents in 2016, I laid down some ground rules. They were to treat me with the respect of an adult. They would not pester my girlfriend. And they would not speak to me like a child or bring up anything from my childhood. Well, no surprise, my mother couldn't do any of those when we actually came to visit for Thanksgiving. So I told her I was done and not to bother calling me until she realized I'm a grown man. She tried to block the door and started quoting the Bible about how parents should be respected by their children. I told her she didn't respect me, so I wouldn't respect her. In December of that year, I got multiple calls, emails, and texts from her begging me to come to Christmas and not to bring my girlfriend. I said if she wasn't welcome, then neither was I. She called me unreasonable and called my girlfriend an interference in our special bond. And no woman should come between a mother and her son. Then she practically ordered me to go. When I refused, she started making empty threats of self-harm. I told her she could do what she liked with her own body. But I would not be coming to Christmas and would instead be spending it with my girlfriend's family. My mother said I'd regret that decision and ended the call in a rage. Well, 2 days before Christmas, the door to the small house my girlfriend and I were renting was kicked in by police, who were convinced that we were running a meth lab. We were detained and interrogated while police turned our yard into a veritable flea market, as a lot of our furniture and personal belongings were brought outside and arranged in rows to be inspected. They went through the house with a fine-tooth comb with drug-sniffing dogs and found nothing more than aspirin and some medication I had at the time for depression. Needless to say, they were visibly disappointed by that. I guess they'd hoped to get some big drug bust or something. It turns out this all happened because my crazy mother had called them and given details that were so accurate that she had to have been stalking us at some point. She claimed that I was using my camper as a front to sell meth. My guess is that she watched a lot of Breaking Bad. When the police found nothing in the house, both vehicles and the camper, they were forced to put everything back and let us go. Understandably, we were furious. But I couldn't really do anything other than file a complaint because they'd caused some damage to the house that my landlord was angry about. As a major stroke of karma, my mother was arrested during her own Christmas Day party in front of most of the family. The investigation later showed that she'd taken a flight to my state. And then she spent a few days following us around, taking pictures of me, my girlfriend, and our home. She'd broken in and photographed everything she could, right down to the underwear in my dresser. That was especially creepy. And police found she documented where I worked and what times my girlfriend and I were usually home or at our jobs. We're not really sure what her overall goal was, but it likely involved more than just trying to give me a scare with the cops. I filed for a restraining order, and my mother spent 2 years in jail for filing a false police report and stalking. While my mother was in lockup, I reconnected with my family, and they all admitted they'd known for years the way she was around me, and they were sorry about not doing anything to help. Especially my father. He cried while giving me a huge apology over the phone. He filed for divorce after my mother was released from jail. And in the divorce, my mother got the house, mainly because my father no longer wanted and agreed to let her have his share in it in exchange for a clean split. The court ruled he didn't have to pay any alimony anyway because they were already both retired. So he chose to move closer to me and now lives in the same state out of an Airstream trailer he'd already owned since the 90s along the West Coast. He said he spends his evenings sipping tea and watching the waves, and he couldn't be happier. My mother didn't take the divorce well and tried to draw it out. But several family members came forward with witness statements. My sisters all showed up to speak about what she was really like. And some relatives even had some recordings about the creepy things my mom used to say. On top of all that, it got out that my mother had not only cheated on my father but done so multiple times with different men. A few of them came forward during the divorce with proof. The judge ended up refusing to let my mother draw out the divorce any longer, and even her lawyer told her to let it go if she wanted to keep her pension intact. And when it was all over, my mother was basically left alone in the old family home, and hardly anyone wants anything to do with her anymore. She's reached out to me on several occasions, but I just told her this was the result of her own deeds, and now she'd have to live with it. She tried to say she was getting therapy, but I told her that she should have done that a long time ago, and I really didn't care anymore because she couldn't undo the things she'd already done. She just cried and hung up the phone. I haven't spoken to her since. TLDR, my crazy, controlling mother clung to me and infantilized me all my life, so I moved away. Then she refused to come home for Christmas because she couldn't accept my GF, so she stalked me and then called the police on me, claiming I was a drug dealer, to try and ruin my holiday. She got arrested on Christmas Day, then my father divorced her, and no one wants anything to do with her now. On my 21st birthday, my mother tried to act like she was my bride. This is a roller coaster. Anyone who's seen my original post knows the level of infantilizing insanity my mother had towards me. She practically wanted me to be attached to her hip and wanted me to be perpetually a child. This is only one of the many nasty things she did. I don't intend to make many posts, but with this story, I feel like I want to get away from my original post. It was late 2012, and I was turning 21. I was the last person in my friend circle to reach that age. So we decided the best way to enjoy my birthday was to have it at a local bar. My mother didn't like this idea because she didn't think it appropriate. But the rest of the family told me to enjoy the day the way I'd like. So I decided the bar was what I wanted. My mother did call me a few times, asking me to change my mind. But I wasn't going. Every single birthday I had while living with my parents, my mother told me all about her. She always dressed up like she was going to extravagant party and always made herself the center of attention. She hovered over me every time I blew out the candles on my cakes, and she had to be in every photo taken of me. I stayed at my parents' house as long as I could stand it to save money. And believe me, I was saving every spare cent in a savings account. Now it was time for my 21st birthday, and I was determined to not let her ruin it or make it about her. One of my friends brought a small chocolate cake, and it only had one candle on it in the shape of a 21. Some of my favorite tunes were playing on the jukebox, and I was enjoying gin and tonic. Then my mother showed up. She pranced in wearing what looked like a wedding dress of some sort, and her hair was done up in what I think would be best described as Disney Cinderella style. Her face was caked in makeup to try and not look almost 50, and my dad walked in behind her, wearing his church suit. He didn't look happy. My mother pranced toward me and latched onto my arm. And when I say pranced, I mean pranced. She had a hop with every step, but I pulled away from her and made her let go. I adamantly said I was not going to be holding her arm, and I was going to enjoy my birthday the way I saw fit. She didn't like hearing that and still wanted my arm. Every time I got up to try and do anything, she latched onto me and tried to parade me around. One guy there I didn't know made a joke that we looked like such a happy couple. My mother blushed, like she was my girlfriend or something. That made me snap, and I called out what the guy said is disgusting. And I was not marrying my crazy mother. My mother then gave me a shocked and then saddened look, like her inner world had just crumbled. Then she turned on the waterworks. Everyone was staring. I just walked into the men's bathroom. She couldn't follow me in there. My dad walked in a few minutes later and said my mother had calmed down, and it was safe to come out. But she'd planted herself in my seat at the table, and I was told to move when it was time to do the cake. She didn't want to, but my dad made her get up. And my friends made sure to sit in places that kept my mother from sitting close to me or being directly in my line of sight. My best friend lit the cake, and before I could blow it out, I noticed my mother was hovering creepily close behind me. I snapped and told her she wasn't going to do this to me again, and to sit down or go away. She started making a scene, and my dad had to make her stop. Lots of people around the bar were looking at my mother and laughing. She started doing that kind of angry squinting where you expect tears any second. Then I just sat back down. My friends took pictures of me and made sure my mother wasn't in a single one of them. Not for lack of trying, anyway. My mother finally hit her breaking point when I got to start dancing with a girl while a live band played. We picked that day to have the party because a local band was there in the evening, and they were playing some great classic rock. I started dancing with a nice red-haired girl when my mother suddenly grabbed me by the arm and started forcibly trying to dance with me. I had to pry her off, and she screamed at me so loudly that my ears were hurting, and the band stopped playing. She tried to grab me by the ear like she used to when she scolded me, but I slapped her hand away. She screamed at me that I was embarrassing her on her day. I retorted that it wasn't her day. It was never her day. It was mine. She yelled that she gave birth to me, and that made her day. I said that was not how it worked, and that this was my day and my day alone. And then my friends all backed me up. The band was even telling my mother off. One even called her a hag, if I recall correctly. Suddenly she was looking everywhere at everybody, and you could finally see how much of a scene she was making. I don't know if you've ever seen everyone in a bar go dead silent while staring at one person, but they did. And one of the employees just pointed to the door and told her to leave. The girl I'd been dancing with, seemingly on cue, also grabbed my arm and told me to just ignore my mother and have a good time. My mother then had a mental breakdown and ran out of the bar, loudly crying like a girl who'd just had her prom day ruined. My dad did not follow. Instead, he just ordered another beer. The rest of the evening was a blast because, after the bar, we all went back to my best friend's house and played old video games. Drunk Mario Kart is surprisingly fun. The next time I saw my mother, she acted like the events of my 21st birthday had never happened. And on my 22nd birthday, I celebrated the same way, at the same bar. My mother showed up for that one too. But she didn't try to pull any of the same crap she did before. And she walked out in the middle of the party when I was dancing with my then girlfriend. Later that year, I moved away, and my mother hasn't attended one of my birthdays since. My mother, the infantilizer, argued with a judge because she felt she'd done no wrong. While I did press charges on my mother for stalking me and trying to frame me as a drug dealer, I didn't want to spend much time in court because that meant being near her. So the events I'm about to describe are half from me and half from my dad. They probably aren't very accurate. It was 5 years ago. So please don't savage me if anything sounds off. It's something I've mostly tried to put behind me. To start off with, my dad actually didn't know that my crazy mother had taken a flight to my state to stalk me. She claimed to him that she was just going to take a small vacation away from everyone for her own mental health. And she never said where she was going. And my poor dad didn't know what she was about to do, or he'd have warned me. My mother then spent several days secretly following me and my girlfriend around with her smartphone. She used the spare key we kept hidden inside a fake rock to get into the house we were living in at the time. She then photographed everything she could, even more intimate things I'd rather not describe. Then, after she returned home, my dad said she looked really smug about something. He described it as the kind of look someone has when they think they've won. And she seemed unusually happy and giddy until the police came and arrested her on Christmas. Dad said she was bawling her eyes out and saying she didn't do anything wrong as she was being carted out by the cops. The evidence against her was clear. All of the photos were found on her phone, and my dad quickly realized what she'd done. The call my mother made to claim I was selling drugs was even made from her own smartphone. The call was recorded and was very easily traced back to her phone. When my mother was confronted with the evidence, my dad said she just started crying and begging. And when she refused to get up from the table, the police had to move her. Dad said she just totally went limp and refused to cooperate. No one bailed her out of jail either. She had to use her own money to get herself out. Dad said she wanted to call me to beg. But I guess, in a rare moment of clarity, she figured out there was no way in hell I'd bail her out after what she did. So she spent a while locked up before finally using her own money to get out. She didn't try to run. In fact, she firmly believed herself to be justified in what she'd done and felt like she could sway a judge to her point of view. Her lawyer advised that she just plead guilty. So she fired him and said she'd represent herself. Well, that went about as well as you can imagine. She was in court faster than I thought. And my girlfriend and I had to fly over to testify against my mother. But I only stayed as long as they needed me. And I was on the first flight I could get back. But while I was there, my mother seemed to stare at me almost constantly. The stares ranged from her creepy, pleading look to absolute rage. When my mother took the stand, she gave a speech about why she believed she was right. I needed to be taught a lesson for refusing to come home and for putting some W before her. Because she should have been the only woman I'd ever need. She also tried to keep staring at me the entire time she was making this speech. But the judge repeatedly told her not to do that. I left before the sentencing. The judge believed my mother to be mentally ill. But when he stated this, she went off on him, saying that she was completely sane. Of course, that just made her look more crazy. She said she was just a mother looking out for her son. And she did what she had to do to teach me a lesson. My dad spoke up and said if she was really looking out for me, she wouldn't have tried to make her own son into her second husband or frame me for something I didn't do just for refusing her. That made her go off on him, and guards had to keep them apart. The judge was originally going to be more lenient on my mother, but she decided she needed some real time behind bars and was sentenced to 2 years in prison with 3 years of probation. When she was sentenced, my mother went full toddler and had a tantrum of pounding her fists and crying like a baby. She had to be carried out of the courtroom because she refused to cooperate again. My dad described the next 2 years without her there as being absolute bliss. And he made up his mind that he'd be ready to divorce her as soon as she was out. And I mean giving her the papers on the very day she came home. And that was the same day he left that house for good. He owns an Airstream trailer and parked it at a friend's house. From there, he spent months fighting my crazy mother in the divorce. That's when more crazy stuff about her came out. My dad eventually won and moved to my state with his trailer as soon as he could. Aside from a few rare phone calls from her, I've not associated with my mother again. And neither has my dad. He spent some time just living as a retired man on the coast. But then he decided to get a simple part-time job in a fish cannery because he was bored. He says it pays the bills. And he's made a lot of friends. He's happy. And I'm happy he's happy. I visit him on weekends when I can. My mother, though, hasn't spoken a word to her in 2 years. Any number she ever used to call me with after court was blocked. I am done with her. Edit, I forgot to mention. When I took the stand against my mother, I spilled my guts on all the creepy SHT she did to me. All the stuff from my first post came out, and I had to make myself stop. Everyone but my mother in the courtroom was openly disgusted. And my mother just started crying the moment all eyes were on her. The part where I told everyone she'd called my GF an interloping W to some imaginary special bond. She perceived us as having really struck a nerve as I became furious just speaking of it. My mother defended herself and tried to say we did have that borderline incestuous bond. But I stated that it was all in her head and always was. That made her have a breakdown, and court had to be ended for the day soon after that. I wasn't needed there anymore and flew home with my girlfriend that very night. The last stand of the infantilizer. Hey all, this should be my final update. And it's going to be a rough one. For all of you who said my mother would try whatever she could to contact me after her probation was over, you were exactly right. In 5 years, she still has not let go of whatever crazy has been floating around in her head. And she was still after me with the same incestuous mentality she had before. Here's what happened. My aunt contacted me and said that my mother was looking to hire a private investigator to find me since no one in the family would tell her where I was. Fortunately, she was just blowing hot air with that because she couldn't afford a pie without losing a chunk of her retirement saving. Barely any relatives talked with her other than a check-in now and then to make sure she was still breathing. And they said she was generally just quiet, antisocial, and remorseful. It turns out she was just biding her time. All that therapy she supposedly went to in the past few years was just for show. She hasn't changed at all. No, I take that back. She's changed, just for the worse. She wanted her probation and my row against her to expire. And then she went right back to her old self. She started wearing colorful dresses in public that can be described as bad bridesmaids and Disney princesses. She's almost 60 years old and has started to only go out dressed up that way. She spent the last 3 years after prison slowly collecting the dresses and putting up the act of a broken old woman that no one loved. And anyone who saw her said that those dresses were all she wore once her probation was over. Even around the house, it was her primary attire. It wouldn't surprise me if she spent more money on makeup and hair dye than she did on food every month. To that end, she also went nuts with the keto diet to lose weight this past year. And she admittedly lost a lot. But she cakes her face in makeup and does up her hair in all the ways you'd expect someone in the most extreme denial about their age to be doing. My aunt sent me some photos of her, and they were far worse than how she looked on my 21st birthday. Imagine a thin Disney version of that woman from the Drew Carey show who caked her face in makeup every episode. That's the infantilizer. A lot of you would say right now to just stay in contact. But that was easier said than done. My mother may not know where I live anymore, but she knows which state I'm in and also believes I couldn't be too far from my dad, which she was exactly right about. My mother was threatening to go to my state and literally look everywhere for me. Imagine an old woman dressed full-on Disney princess in the middle of a city passing around photos of me from nearly a decade ago and asking people where I am and telling them whatever she wants about me. I can only imagine the creepy SHT that would have come out of her mouth. I wasn't about to let that happen. I spoke with several family members, and we mutually agreed that the only way my mother wouldn't come running her Disney princess arse to my state to try and find me would be to speak with her myself in advance. I know a lot of you are probably mentally screaming, "Don't do it. She's a psycho." Well, you're not wrong. But at the same time, I'm sick of running. And she had no idea what I looked like after more than 5 years. Gone was the boy she knew. I'm bigger, more muscular, and have a nice beard. I've even learned some boxing from a friend at the gym. He still kicks my ass, but I hold my own. My aunt helped me arrange to speak with my mother over Skype. My mother was apparently so giddy with excitement that she legit soiled herself and had to go change before we could talk. My aunt was with her on the other end, and I was ready to jump in if things got too crazy. The video call connected, and when we first saw each other, my mother didn't recognize me at all. She just asked who the big, hairy guy in front of the screen was. That was until I spoke. The first words out of my mouth were to sarcastically say you were expecting Prince Charming. She recognized my voice right away and started crying. She was whining and asking me what I'd done to myself. I said I grew up, no thanks to her. My aunt played peacekeeper and calmed everyone down. My mother had to wipe away a lot of her makeup due to her tears making it run. And then she wanted to be excused to go redo it. I said I wasn't waiting for that. We either talked right then or not at all. She whined that she wanted to look good for me, and I told her there was nothing she could do to make me look good. which made her cry some more. Oh noes, my own son doesn't find me attractive. Guess I'll just cry about it. Initially, my GF was not visible. But the second my mother realized she was there, she became super irate and was about to say something damning. But she stopped herself before saying anything worse than, "What is she doing there?" I told her we still live together, I love her, and we may even one day get married. My mother flopped over onto her couch, crying and acting like a sad diva. I told her to stop being a baby and calm down. Even if my girlfriend and I never marry, I'd still love to grow old with her. My mother actually shouted out, "But I already am old, and I quote am alone." I said that meant nothing to me. And to calm down, I was ending this call, and we'd never speak to each other again. She took a moment to calm down, and my aunt got her a small keto ice cream from her freezer, which she started gluttonously devouring. She got a couple brain freezes and kept whining she's old until she finished all the ice cream. When she was done, she just threw the ice cream tub away, got creepily calm, and said she was ready to talk again. We had some mundane conversation back and forth for a while. She tried to keep asking me intimate details about my life, where I work, and where I live. All that stuff. And every time I refused to answer and told her she's not allowed to have any of those details after she stalked me and tried to frame me as a Breaking Bad drug dealer, she cried out about how that was 5 years ago. And she begged me to look past it. I said she was incredibly lucky I was even speaking to her at all after all of the SHT she's done. To which she went back to crying, and my aunt had to take a few minutes to calm her down. It was petty of us. But my girlfriend and I had a plan to see just how crazy my mother really was. I knew that she was barely keeping herself in check. We waited for just the right opportunity, and my girlfriend leaned in and gave me a kiss on the lips. My mother got this very creepy, wide-eyed look on her face and actually said, "I wish you'd let me kiss you like that too." Everyone went silent. My aunt, who'd been playing peacekeeper, looked like she'd just been slapped in the face. And I said, "That's it. I'm done. You haven't changed at all." My girlfriend hugged me, and I embraced her while saying she was my one and only. My mother lost her SHT at that and started screaming. That's when I slammed the laptop closed and shut it off. My aunt, on the other end, had it very rough. My mother started attacking her like a lunatic, and the police had to be called. My mother ended up in a psyche hold because she attacked the police too. It must have been like a scene from a horror movie or video game with an old woman in heavily smeared and runny makeup and a Disney princess dress attacking people like a wild animal. The police arrested her after shooting her with pepper spray, and soon enough she was thrown into a psyche ward. She's already been in there for a few months now and has been deemed a danger to herself and others. After being locked up, my mother started threatening self-termination if I didn't come to see her. She also demanded to have her makeup and dresses allowed, which was obviously denied. My aunt was initially the only one who went to visit her, and somehow she was given my mother's legal power of attorney. I don't know the ins and outs of how, but I don't care either. My aunt has told me my mother seems truly broken now. They have her under constant watch, and she wants to unalive. She stopped crying for me, but she spent a lot of time in serious denial because she was convinced I would come for her. Then, of all people, my dad visited her. Not too long ago, he packed up his trailer and drove all the way back to our home state. My mother was not happy to see him. I don't know what was said between them, but I heard he savaged her. It doesn't take much to make her cry. But whatever he said was far worse. I think he's held those words in for 5 years. But whatever he said had a strong enough impact that she nearly went catatonic. My aunt told me that my mother became more cooperative after that and has stopped crying because Prince Charming hasn't come for her. My dad didn't stick around. He spent about 2 weeks catching up with everyone and headed over to New Mexico. He has a cousin over there, and he says he feels like being in the desert for a while because the salty air at the coast is eating away at his truck and trailer. He also hates seafood. So that's where he's at now. One of my younger cousins on my mother's side who has a pregnant girlfriend is moving into my mother's house and will keep up with the maintenance, bills, and taxes for it in exchange for not needing to pay rent. And they may be able to stay there as long as my mother is locked up or until she passes away. Either way, I wouldn't want to live there, even if I were to leave the house when she passed. I just want nothing to do with her. I'm happy my mother won't be coming to look for me. But at the same time, I'm completely indifferent to the fact that she's been locked up in a padded cell. She lost any feelings of care I had for her a long time ago, and I'd have beaten the SHT out of her myself had she come after me again. It looks like I may never need to do that, though. If she ever gets out of there, I'll be applying for another restraining order right away. But I and my aunt are fairly confident she'll be locked up for a long time. Maybe for the rest of her life, I hope. Thank you for watching the video.